That dog needs to leave. Now. I don't care what vest it's wearing. The gate area went quiet in that specific way crowded rooms do right before something ugly happens, conversations trailing off mid-sentence, phones lowering, a dozen strangers all turning toward the same spot at once. A woman in an oversized visor and a blazer that looked slightly too formal for air travel was standing over a man in his early 30s, sunglasses on despite being indoors, one hand resting lightly on the harness of a golden retriever lying calmly at his feet. His white cane was folded on the seat beside him. "Ma'am, he's a certified guide dog," the man said, patient in a way that suggested he'd had this exact conversation more times than anyone should have to. "He's allowed anywhere I go." "Not around me, he's not. I have severe allergies, and frankly, I don't believe you people actually need these animals half the time." I was sitting 4 seats down, and I remember my stomach dropping the second she said, "You people." Because I had a feeling, a very strong feeling, that this was about to become the kind of story I'd be telling for years. I had no idea, at that point, just how right I was. Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I fly enough for work that airports have basically become a second living room to me, and I've come to accept a strange truth about them: nowhere else on earth do you see human behavior get quite this unfiltered. People who'd never dream of yelling at a stranger in a grocery store suddenly turn into completely different people the second a flight delay or a seating dispute enters the picture. Today's story is about a woman I'm going to call HOA Karen, not because she actually mentioned an HOA right away, but because, trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why that title fits her perfectly. This is a story about a legitimate service dog, a woman who decided the rules simply didn't apply to her, some very suspicious disappearing items, a terminal-wide public meltdown, and an airport canine unit that showed up at exactly the wrong moment, for her, anyway. If you're into real airport drama and satisfying karma stories, stick around, because this one's a ride. And if you like this kind of content, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Let me back up a little, because I want you to understand just how normal this day started out. I was flying home after a work conference, nothing glamorous, just 3 days of conference rooms and bad hotel coffee, and I was more than ready to get back to my own bed. My flight wasn't until early evening, so I'd gotten to the airport with time to spare, grabbed a sandwich from one of those overpriced terminal cafes, and found a seat near my gate to wait it out. It was a slow travel day. The kind where the gate area has that low hum of quiet activity, someone on a work call 2 rows over, a toddler napping across 3 seats while their parents scrolled on their phone, an older couple sharing a crossword puzzle. Nothing about it suggested drama was coming. If anything, it felt like one of those rare, easy airport experiences where everything just moves the way it's supposed to. I noticed the man with the guide dog fairly early on, mostly because the dog itself was impossible not to notice, a beautiful, calm golden retriever, clearly well-trained, lying quietly at his handler's feet without so much as flinching at the noise and movement around him. A few kids nearby had asked their parents if they could pet him, and each time, the parents gently explained that working dogs shouldn't be approached while they're on duty. Standard, polite, respectful airport etiquette. I settled into my book, genuinely looking forward to an uneventful flight home. I had absolutely no idea that within the hour, that exact gate area was going to turn into the kind of scene people don't forget for a long time. I remember pulling out my phone to check the gate screen one more time, confirming boarding wouldn't start for another 40 minutes, and settling back into a genuinely relaxed headspace, the kind you only really get toward the tail end of a work trip, when the hard part is already behind you and all that's left is getting home. I people watched a little, the way you do in airports when you've got nothing better to occupy your attention. A businessman 2 rows down was typing furiously on a laptop, clearly racing a deadline. A young couple near the window was arguing quietly about whether to check a bag or not. Ordinary, forgettable airport noise. The guide dog's handler, for his part, seemed completely at ease too, occasionally reaching down to rest a hand on his dog's back, the two of them radiating the kind of calm, practiced partnership that comes from years of working together. If you'd asked me right then to guess which two people at that gate were about to become the center of a viral-worthy confrontation, I genuinely wouldn't have picked either of them, which, in hindsight, says a lot about how these things usually start. Quietly, and from a direction nobody's watching. She arrived at the gate maybe 20 minutes after I sat down, and, much like the other Karens I've had the pleasure of encountering in airports, you could hear her before you saw her. "This is completely unacceptable," she was saying into her phone, loud enough that half the gate area glanced up out of habit. "I specifically requested an aisle seat away from any pet passengers, and now I'm hearing there might be an animal at this gate. Someone needs to fix this. Let's call her Diane." Mid-50s, sharp blazer, a designer tote bag she kept adjusting like it was a fashion accessory rather than actual luggage, and an energy that suggested she expected the entire airport to reorganize itself around her preferences the moment she arrived. She ended the call, scanned the gate area with the focused intensity of someone conducting an inspection, and her eyes landed directly on the golden retriever lying peacefully near his handler's feet. I watched her expression shift, not fear exactly, more like the specific irritation of someone who's just spotted a rule violation they intend to personally correct. She didn't approach right away. Instead, she pulled out her phone again and, from what I could tell watching from a few seats over, appeared to be looking something up, possibly airline pet policies, possibly just working herself up further. Either way, it was clear she was building toward something. About 10 minutes later, she made her move. Diane walked directly up to the man with the guide dog, plopped herself into the empty seat beside him without asking, and launched straight into it. "Excuse me, is that a service animal or an emotional support animal? Because there's a difference, and I need to know which policy applies here." "He's a certified guide dog," the man replied evenly. "I'm visually impaired. He assists me with mobility and navigation." "Do you have documentation for that?" "Because airlines require documentation now, you know. I've read about people abusing the system. Under the ADA, staff and airlines aren't permitted to require documentation for service animals," he said, still calm, though I could hear the practiced weariness in his voice, the tone of someone who'd clearly had to explain this exact thing to strangers more times than should ever be necessary. "They can ask two questions: whether the dog is required because of a disability, and what task it's trained to perform. That's it." "Well, I have severe allergies, and I think my needs matter here too," Diane said, raising her voice slightly, clearly aware that people nearby were starting to listen. "I want that dog moved to a different area of the gate, or removed from the terminal altogether." "He's not going anywhere," the man said simply. "I have every right to be here with him." Diane's jaw tightened. She stood up, smoothed her blazer, and said, loud enough for the entire gate area to hear clearly, "We'll see about that." Then she walked off toward the gate desk, phone already back out, presumably to lodge whatever complaint she thought was going to get her the outcome she wanted. I watched her go, half expecting the gate agent to simply reiterate the same policy explanation and send her back to her seat, no harm done. That's usually how these things go: a frustrated passenger vents, gets a polite but firm answer, and eventually cools off once they realize the rules aren't going to bend just because they're annoyed. I actually turned back to my book at that point, genuinely assuming the worst of it was over. I was wrong. Diane wasn't the type to accept "no" as a final answer, she was the type to treat it as a starting point for round 2. For a while after that, things seemed to settle. The gate agent Diane had cornered politely explained, again, that service animals are permitted in all public areas of the airport and on aircraft, and that there was nothing to fix here. Diane returned to her seat, visibly unsatisfied, arms crossed, glaring occasionally in the direction of the guide dog like he'd personally wronged her. That's when strange things started happening. About 15 minutes later, the man with the guide dog reached down for his cane, which he'd set on the seat beside him, and found it wasn't there. He patted around calmly, clearly used to navigating small inconveniences without panic, but I could see the concern crease his forehead as he asked the woman next to him, quietly, if she'd seen where it went. A few minutes after that, his dog's spare leash, A backup he kept clipped to his bag in case the primary one failed, was missing too. He hadn't moved from his seat the entire time. Then, strangest of all, his boarding documentation, a printed accommodation letter he carried as a courtesy, even though he wasn't legally required to, just to make travel smoother when dealing with unfamiliar staff, had vanished from the outer pocket of his bag. He wasn't making a scene about it. If anything, he seemed almost resigned, like this kind of low-grade harassment was an unfortunate but familiar part of traveling with a disability. But a few of us nearby had definitely noticed Diane getting up twice in that same window, each time walking a slow, unnecessary loop past his row before returning to her own seat. I glanced at the older woman doing the crossword a few seats down. She'd noticed too. We didn't say anything to each other, not yet, but there was a shared, silent understanding forming, the kind that happens when strangers start piecing together the same uncomfortable suspicion at the exact same time. At this point, a few of us decided enough was enough. The man's cane going missing wasn't just inconvenient, it was something that genuinely mattered to his ability to move safely through the terminal, and none of us were comfortable just watching that happen without doing something. I flagged down a gate agent and mentioned, as calmly and factually as I could, that a passenger's cane, spare leash, and documentation had all gone missing within about 20 minutes, and that another passenger had been seen walking unusually close to his row multiple times during that window. The gate agent's expression shifted immediately from polite customer service mode into something more focused. She radioed airport security, explaining the situation, and within a few minutes, 2 members of airport security staff arrived at the gate to look into it. One of them asked the man directly if he'd like to file a report, which he agreed to, still remarkably composed given everything. The other began quietly checking with nearby gate staff about terminal security camera coverage for that specific area. Most major airports have camera coverage throughout gate areas for exactly this kind of situation. While they pulled footage on a tablet at the gate desk, a few of us who'd witnessed the earlier confrontation gave brief statements too, what we'd seen, what we'd heard Diane say, the timing of her trips past his row. It wasn't dramatic. It was just quiet, methodical fact-gathering, the kind that happens far more often in real life than in movies, but it's exactly the kind of thing that ends up mattering most. Within about 10 minutes, the footage told a very clear story. The security officer reviewing the footage didn't need long. On the recording, time-stamped clearly, Diane could be seen walking past the man's row, glancing around to check who was watching, then reaching down and sliding his cane behind a nearby row of seats, not stealing it outright, just relocating it somewhere he'd never think to check. A few minutes later, a second clip showed her doing the same thing with the spare leash, tucking it into the cushion gap of an unoccupied seat a few rows away. The documentation was trickier to spot, but a final piece of footage showed her lifting it from his bag's outer pocket during her second walk, folding it, and slipping it into her own tote bag. The security officer approached Diane directly, tablet in hand. "Ma'am, we have you on camera removing items belonging to the passenger seated in row 14. Can you explain that?" Diane's face did that thing I'd seen before in similar stories, that split-second flash of panic quickly papered over with practiced indignation. "I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't touched anyone's belongings. We have clear footage, ma'am. Multiple clips. Maybe I was just cleaning up. Things were left in walkways. His cane was on the seat beside him. It wasn't in a walkway." By this point, the man's cane and spare leash had already been located exactly where the footage showed them, and the officer gently retrieved them and returned them to him. The documentation was found, folded, in the side pocket of Diane's tote bag when she was asked to open it for verification, which she did, reluctantly, after being informed that airport security had the authority to request it given the active investigation. By now, the entire gate area was fully locked in. Nobody was pretending not to watch anymore. A few phones were out, quietly recording, not for drama's sake, just the natural human instinct to document something everyone sensed was about to become a story worth telling. "This is a complete overreaction," Diane said, her voice climbing as the security officer confirmed the documentation had indeed been in her bag. I was simply concerned about a legitimate safety issue with an unverified animal, and now I'm being treated like a criminal. Ma'am, you took another passenger's mobility cane and personal documents, the officer said, unmoved. That's not a safety concern, that's a property issue, and a serious one given his circumstances. He should have to prove that dog is legitimate, Diane snapped. I have rights too. I have allergies. The man, finally speaking up with a bit more edge in his voice than he'd shown the entire encounter, said, You didn't ask about my dog because of allergies. You asked because you didn't like that he was here. A woman standing near the gate desk, watching the whole thing unfold, said out loud, she literally hit his cane. That's disgusting, and a low murmur of agreement rippled through the surrounding seats. I run my community's HOA back home, Diane said, apparently deciding this was somehow the moment to establish her credentials. I know how to handle situations when people don't follow the rules. This isn't your neighborhood, ma'am, the officer replied evenly. And he wasn't breaking any rules. You were. That line got an audible reaction from at least a dozen people nearby. Someone actually said, "Toof," loud enough for half the gate to hear, and the older woman with the crossword just shook her head slowly, muttering something about, some people, under her breath. If Diane had simply apologized at that point, this story might have ended quietly. Instead, cornered and clearly humiliated, she went the exact opposite direction. She insisted the officer was harassing her over a misunderstanding, demanded to speak to airport management, and, in what I can only describe as a genuinely bizarre pivot, pulled a small dog carrier out from under the seat she'd been sitting in, unzipped it partially, and announced that she also had a service animal that deserved equal consideration, gesturing to a small, clearly nervous terrier mix peeking out from inside. If his dog gets special treatment, so does mine, she said, loud enough for the whole area to hear. The security officer, understandably skeptical given everything that had just happened, asked whether the dog was registered or trained for a specific task related to a disability. Diane hesitated for just a beat too long before saying, she helps with my anxiety. That would classify as an emotional support animal, ma'am, not a service animal, and airlines aren't required to accommodate those the same way, the officer explained. Also, was that dog declared at check-in or security? Diane didn't answer right away, which, in a gate area full of people who'd already watched her get caught lying twice, was answer enough. The officer radioed for backup, explaining the situation had now expanded to include an undeclared animal potentially brought through security without proper screening, which, at any airport, is treated as a legitimate security concern, not just a minor policy hiccup. About 5 minutes later, the situation escalated in a way absolutely nobody at that gate saw coming, including, judging by her face, Diane herself. A member of the airport's Canine security unit arrived, a sharp-eyed officer accompanied by a working dog trained to detect prohibited items. Standard procedure, the officer explained calmly, whenever an undeclared animal is discovered to have potentially bypassed standard security screening, the dog's carrier itself needed to be checked, since anything could theoretically have been concealed alongside the animal during the security process. Diane, visibly rattled now, tried to protest that this was unnecessary, but the officer explained it wasn't optional at this point, given the documented pattern of dishonest behavior already on record from the earlier incident. The detection dog approached the carrier, sniffed briefly, then sat, a clear, trained alert. A secondary hand search of the carrier's lining revealed a small, undeclared bag of prescription medication, unlabeled, tucked into a hidden compartment sewn into the carrier's base. Not something dangerous exactly, but absolutely something that should have been declared, especially once the carrier itself had bypassed normal screening by being passed off as a pet accessory rather than a bag requiring inspection. Whatever the explanation was going to be, Diane didn't get much chance to offer one. Within minutes, she was being escorted, along with her dog and her belongings, toward the airport security office for further processing, missing her flight entirely in the process. The gate area, for a moment, went almost completely silent. Then someone near the front, quietly but clearly, said, "Well." That escalated. A ripple of stunned, slightly relieved laughter went through the crowd. The man with the guide dog, cane back in hand, leash reattached, simply exhaled and reached down to scratch his dog gently behind the ears, like the whole thing had finally, properly ended. Word travels fast through a gate area, and by the time boarding finally started, delayed slightly due to the whole ordeal, most of us had introduced ourselves to each other in that easy, temporary camaraderie that forms when strangers witness something wild together. The older woman with the crossword turned out to be a retired teacher who told me she'd seen every kind of misbehavior imaginable in 30 years of classrooms, and still ranked this near the top. A businessman 2 rows down exchanged contact information with the guide dog's handler, offering to serve as a witness if anything further came of the incident report. Several of us, myself included, gave brief statements to airport security before boarding, confirming what we'd seen, the missing cane, the missing leash, the documentation, and everything that followed. It felt important to make sure the full story was on record, not just the last chaotic 5 minutes of it. The man with the guide dog, once things had settled, thanked several of us quietly for speaking up, admitting this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, though it was, by a wide margin, the most dramatic resolution he'd ever witnessed. His dog, through all of it, hadn't moved from his side once, calm, steady, exactly as trained. We boarded not long after, and the flight itself was, refreshingly, completely uneventful, the kind of quiet, easy flight I'd been hoping for at the start of the day, just with a much better story attached to it by the time I landed. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about this whole afternoon. Diane didn't get in trouble because a stranger's service dog inconvenienced her. She got in trouble because she decided her own discomfort, imagined or not, gave her the right to interfere with someone else's basic, legally protected access to safe travel. Service animals aren't a courtesy extended to make other passengers happy. They're a necessity, protected by law, for people who genuinely need them. Treating that as some kind of negotiable inconvenience, and then escalating to actively sabotaging a stranger's mobility aids, isn't just rude, it's the kind of behavior that reveals exactly how someone thinks the world should work when they believe no one's watching. The lesson here isn't really about dogs, or airports, or even about Diane specifically. It's about the quiet decision so many of us make, in small moments, to either stand by or step in when we see someone being mistreated. That gate area could have stayed silent. Instead, a handful of strangers decided a missing cane mattered enough to say something, and that decision changed how the entire story ended. So here's my question for you: if you'd been sitting in that gate area and noticed someone quietly hiding a stranger's cane, would you have said something right away, or waited to see how it played out first, the way a lot of us initially did? Let me know in the comments, and if you've ever witnessed something like this yourself, at an airport, or anywhere else, I'd genuinely love to hear it, because these real stories are always more unbelievable than anything I could make up. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, Diane was not the last Karen I've encountered at an airport, and she definitely won't be the last one on this channel.